60 million colors wreak some havoc in your head.
Sega Saturn.
Welcome to TitanCast, your home for Sega Saturn news, commentary, personal stories, and more. I'm one of your hosts, Samuel, otherwise known as the Southern Sega Gentleman, SSG for short. Next up, we have the man from Manchester, our patron saint, Father K, or Simon if you'd like. Last but not least, we have our West Coast correspondent, Virtual Schlub, the man himself, Brian. All right, today we figured that we were going to go ahead and get started with how we got introduced to the Sega Saturn and how, after its short lifetime, we kept up the spirit, we kept up the life, and we kept fighting on. And eventually we found ourselves here in 2017 starting up this nice little, rebirth of sorts of the Saturn Junkyard. So with that being said, I figured we'd kind of veer over to our founder, the Lord himself, the man from Manchester, Father K.
Hello there. Hi.
What exactly brought you to the Sega Saturn way back in 1994 or so?
Okay, I'd had a Mega Drive or a Genesis, as it's known, and I really enjoyed playing different games on that, the kind of Double Dragon stuff and, I don't know, Shinobi and so on. But I also really loved my Sega Golf, so I bought a Saturn because my Mega Drive had died and I wanted a next generation console. And that's what led me to the Saturn was playing golf on the Mega Drive, believe it or not.
So what do you think was probably the main game that you played constantly whenever that console was actually in relevance?
Well, the main game for me was there was two, in fact. The ones that I got with the console, which were Virtua Fighter, and I also got Sega Rally. And anyone who's played Sega Rally will know that once you've played that once, you have to play it again and again and again. So Sega Rally was my definite game that sealed the Saturn for me. It sealed it in my heart and it's kept there. And it's a game that I still play to this day.
All right, so we all sit here, and in the late 90s, Sega of America and Sega of Japan were up on this completely different wavelength. They didn't know what the hell was going on with each other. There was no internal communication, and if there was any communication, it was just insanity, really. So with the demise of the Saturn in the late 90s, the rise of the Dreamcast, did you just stick with the Saturn, or did you move over to the next consoles, or did you even privy over into like the Sonys and the Nintendos?
Okay, there was a bit of a conflict going on in my house because although I had the Saturn, I had two sons that were desperate to get a PlayStation. So the Christmas after I bought my Saturn, we found a Sony PlayStation under the tree, and that then became the console that was under the TV in the living room. And we only had one TV in those days, so the Saturn kind of got shelved in our house for a little bit. And then there was no Dreamcast. We bought a PS2 because of the DVD function. I was one of those terrible people that helped to kill the Dreamcast. I didn't get a Dreamcast till 2004. So there's a confession straight off the bat from somebody who writes on the Dreamcast Junkyard.
Lord Jesus. All right, so what do you think about that, Brian?
You can scratch that if you want.
You know what? I mean, yeah, Simon, you're part of the problem, but, in many ways, I think we all were in our own way. Everybody, we all wanted DVD players, and it was the cheapest one. What were you going to do?
Well, I'll say from my standpoint, I got into the Saturn, and I was a latecomer to the whole process. I mean, I was still young. There wasn't a whole lot of money up in the household, so we got what we could when we could. And my Saturn was a used one. But I will say this in my defense before I can actually tell my story. I was one of the guys in '99 who got a Dreamcast, but at the same time, I also dropped a little bit of cash and got me a PS2 up in 2000. So, I mean, I'm not the best example, but at least I had a Dreamcast.
Well, I think it's good that we're purging ourselves tonight and we're all coming out with a little bit of shame that perhaps we've carried around with us for too long. I have to say, though, that I kept my Saturn throughout those PS1 days and throughout the PS2 days. I kept my Saturn. It was one console that I bought around launch time that I kept, and I never got rid of it. So that I actually had, when I got interested in the Dreamcast and bought almost the entire library, the UK library, at the same time that you could buy many Dreamcast games for about £2.50, which I guess would be about $5 at the time. We also had stands and stands of Saturn games for sale, and they were going for even less than that. They would probably retail at about £1 or £2 for each one. So at the same time as I was building up my Dreamcast collection, I was also building up quite a sizable Saturn collection, and that's perhaps what gave it a second birth for me in around about 2006. I think that was when I had my inspiration to start the Saturn Junkyard. So I've had maybe three stages of Saturn love: 1996, 2006, and then again 2016, 2017. I've had three stages.
All right. So Brian, you know, you're like me. You're an American, and I take it you've been out in the West Coast for the most of your life. I
Yeah.
mean, granted, Seattle and Washington, that entire part of the country is just it's a central hub of so much. I mean, you've got Microsoft there, you've got Nintendo there, uh, and the retro scene is insane there today. But what exactly got you involved? I mean, I take it you were a Sega fan before the Saturn. But were you an early comer to the Saturn or a late bloomer of sorts?
Yeah, certainly the latter. So speaking of Sega in general, I think I came of gaming age around the time that Sonic the Hedgehog and the Genesis or Mega Drive were popular. So I was a big fan of Sonic 1 and 2 and 3 and Knuckles and all of those, and I played those quite a bit. I don't know, when I was like 8 or 9. But then I actually missed out on the Saturn. I'm kind of the opposite of Simon here, where I actually didn't get a Saturn until way later, maybe like the mid 2000s. I picked one up in an eBay lot. The irony, though, is I had a Dreamcast. Just like you, Sam, I was 99.99. I was like right there for the launch. So I saved up my money all summer to get a copy of Sonic Adventure and a VMU along with my console. So I actually had quite a bit of love and nostalgia for the Genesis and the Dreamcast well before I ever got a Saturn. But the Saturn I was pretty interested in when it came out, particularly Knights and all of the arcade, classics that had been ported over. So I was always intrigued and wanted a Saturn, but at least at that time, it would be another 10 years or so before I would eventually pick one up. But certainly once I did, I think I made up for lost time pretty handily by just getting as many of the classics, or at least the affordable ones, as I could. I just love that system. And to this day, I still just love collecting for it. And I think even though I don't really have the nostalgic attachment to the Saturn like I did with the other two, I think I like it just as much, about as much as the Dreamcast.
Yeah, and I mean, a lot of people are drawn to that whole nostalgia aspect of it. I mean, I know countless people who have wanted me to get together with them, get their consoles back up and running, or they just picked up a crap console somewhere at a pawn shop or something. And that's where I see a lot of people at. I mean, like I was talking about with me, the mid '90s, I can't say I was nostalgic enough during, looking back on it, but at the time period, I mean, all my friends were Nintendo. Everybody was Nintendo. You know exactly what I'm talking about. Nintendo of America had the United States on lock until Sony come around.
Yeah.
But whenever it came to me, I was the outlier. I was the guy who had the Genesis. Everybody come over to my house to play the Genesis, and with the rare exception of some kind of title that was specific, like F-Zero or something like that, everybody wanted to come over and hear what was going on with the Genesis because it was a different game. It always was. So whenever
Yeah.
the Saturn came around, we were not a situation for me to be able to get a Saturn at launch. There was no way it was going to happen. And Sony, even though there was commercials all over the place, I never really bought into the whole Sony thing. Yeah, my friends had them and everything, but it was the new guy on the block. I didn't know nothing about him. You know, there was Crash Bandicoot and there was a couple of other games, but everything that I saw in the magazines was always on the Saturn. There was a whole bunch of ports. So whenever it came, I think it was 1997. Yeah, 1997. I picked up the Saturn. Okay, and I picked it up used, and we had that bulky, just stupid looking controller, but we didn't know any better, man. I loved that controller back in the day, and my first game was actually Resident Evil, okay, and it was right after it come off, and that instilled my love for Resident Evil. That game scared the living hell out of me with the choppy blocks and everything else going on, and I can remember I could not defeat the snake. I can't tell you how many weeks went by. I kept trying to kill the snake, kept trying to kill the snake. And then my buddy who had it on the PS1 said, dude, you don't even got to kill the snake. Just run over to the hole up in the back, grab the little emblem, and then run out the room. And I was like, are you serious? Because in my brain, I was like, dude, the door's got to be locked or something. And seeing how, we didn't have a lot of money. I mean, that was the only game I had for the longest time. I think the next game I got was actually, it was SimCity. And everybody, both of y'all know my love for SimCity, and everybody else is probably going to put me up on a cross for it. But that was my game, man. I mean, we played it at school on the computers, and then I got to come home and play it, and it was just mind blowing. Not to mention I could put little statues of Sonic all over the place, so that was cool as hell. You
Yeah, that's
know?
a nice touch.
Yeah, exactly, man. And whenever it came time for the Dreamcast, I wasn't a 99.99er because I did not have that kind of change back in the day, but it wasn't that crazy expensive. So for Christmas that year, I actually got it as a gift.
Oh,
And to
cool.
be honest with you, I didn't have but like I think I had Crazy Taxi, I had Jet Grind Radio, which is Jet Set Radio for the rest of the world, and I picked up Shenmue later on. And those are like the only three games I had for probably until 2003, 2004. I mean, but for me, that time was especially for Sega. I mean, yeah, eventually I picked up a PS2, but I never really got into the whole PS2 dynamic. I think I might have picked up like 5 or 6 games, but like a lot of people, like Simon was talking about, I used it as a DVD player. That was pretty much it,
Yeah.
you know. Um, I kept my Saturn around, but the thing is that in the mid 2000s, I kind of went through some really rough times, and I got rid of god amount of stuff. And my Saturn and all in my collection, which at that point was probably about 30, 40 games, it went with it too. It wasn't until I got in the late 2000s back into, actually getting into gaming, because there was like a 2 year period there I didn't even game. So I had to pick stuff back up, and it was like starting off from scratch. I mean, I had my PS2 still, I had my Sega Dreamcast, but with the exception of that, I think I had nothing except the current gen at that point. So for me, it was kind of a really, really high point, and then it just kind of bottomed out. And now, well, not now, I've got plenty of stuff now, but probably about 2010 to 12 was complete rebuild mode.
Hmm.
So,
I think it's kind of significant that my third son was born in 1997. So by the time we had three little kids running around the house, my gaming time was very much reduced, and that's going to be my excuse for not having a Dreamcast and not even knowing about the launch date. I had three kids at that point, so
right.
that's what I'm saying, Your Honor.
Yeah. Well,
Well,
plus launch day in Europe, I don't think was quite as catchy as the 99.99 that we had.
no.
No, it wasn't. It wasn't. And you know what? As well, the other thing is, I was going to say on the Nintendo front, we didn't have Nintendo in the UK particularly until the N64. You could get an NES or a SNES, but we didn't really know about them. For us, it was the Master System and
Yeah.
the Mega Drive. So Sega had a massive foothold in Europe that it didn't have in sorry, that Nintendo didn't have, and it was a shame and a surprise when Saturn didn't catch on. I mean, I know we had all the issues with the game development and so on, but Sega had so much of a good base in Europe and could have capitalized on that so much with the Saturn, and it didn't. Its launch and its advertising in the UK weren't perhaps as bad as it was in the US, but the Saturn wasn't a big console. It wasn't well known over here in the UK, and to this day, it's still not. people over here. In fact, I was talking the other day about how when I bought my Saturn, I had to argue with the salesman. He was telling me that I should be buying a PS1, and he argued quite vociferously for some time about how wrong I was to be buying my Saturn. It's the only time I can ever think of that I've had to argue with a salesman to buy
Wow.
something. But
Yeah.
yes,
Yeah, and imagine that happening, across however many stores, across however many regions. I mean, that salesperson influence can have a pretty dramatic impact on console sales overall. I mean, especially at that point where the Saturn is, at least in North America, where the surprise launch, pretty much pissed off a lot of those retailers. And so, several of them refused to even carry the console throughout its lifespan.
Yeah, there's a number of YouTube videos, high quality YouTube videos out there about people talking about the launch of the Sega Saturn. Uh, Monthly Gaming or something along the lines did a really good video on it, and just the amount of backlash from that early launch, and then on top of that, you had Sony coming right behind them, the very first E3, and basically, what was it, 299 or 199, whatever the case was. I mean, their president just walked up to the podium and said, just said a number, and
Yeah,
the
I
crowd
think it's
just
two ninety
erupted.
nine.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, you think about it back then. I mean, what the Dreamcast dropped at 199. I
Hmm.
mean, at least Sega figured out their problems later on. I mean, that's what I was talking about to begin with. There was so much complications between. You had the 32X coming out. You had the Sega CD. You had, Project Neptune in the works. You had all these different projects going on, all these different add-ons in the early 90s. And I mean, people were just burned out, dude. I mean, most of the
Yeah.
people I knew, they didn't even want to touch Sega because of the fact of like, I remember for a while there, the Sega CD was the big deal. If you had a Sega CD, that was top notch, and it just nobody wanted to do it because I mean, dude, at that point, a Sega CD and a Genesis combination box was like almost $400. I mean, it was ridiculous.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean there were all sorts of these challenges and complications, and there are so many mistakes that Sega made that we could point to that if they did this, they could have had more success worldwide with the Saturn. But I mean, I guess part of it, the flip side of that is, why are we still playing it today? Like what is it that's kind of kept it in our hearts and minds? 12 years after the, or no, 22 years after the fact.
Yeah,
Um,
and that's exactly right. And getting to that, how about it, Brian? I mean, you talked about being a late bloomer and everything. I mean,
mhm.
you're talking about 2006, about whenever you finally got been back into it.
Yeah.
So here we are, 2017, 11 years later, and you're playing it voraciously. I mean, your profile picture is you over at, was it Portland Retro Gaming, and you're behind
Oh
a
yeah,
massive
yeah,
Sega sign. I mean, what has kept that drive alive for you, or is it kind of like you've rekindled something?
yeah. Oh yeah, that was their PAX booth. No, you know what? Yeah, I feel like there's a combination of a lot of factors in there. I mean, what's unique with the Saturn for me though, just getting it so late, it was, I never really saw it for what I remembered. I mean, because I was kind of going off a clean slate here. So for me, a lot of the fun is just exploring what it had to offer and kind of its interpretation of this early 3D um, style, and its limit. It's, I mean, in some ways, its technical limitations, I think, really played into the character of the console because you could tell, so many of the developers for it were really struggling to convey their vision in a way that was, that was you kind of take for granted nowadays, where everything looks exactly like it's supposed to. You can have games as big as you want. They can run as smoothly as they need for the most part. And so, you kind of take a lot of those things for granted when you go back in time and look at how developers, and not even just the Saturn, but developers for all of those early 3D systems, and how they were able to get really creative in managing, that that those technical limitations and still building out their vision accordingly. And in the process, creating a ton of new different types of games we would play, and new interpretations of existing genres. But really, I mean, I think the Saturn was just kind of the little console that could in many ways, because it was underpowered compared to the PlayStation and the 64. But nevertheless, I feel like that kind of just helped give it even more charm in many ways. And it's fun to kind of look back nowadays and just see uh, what they were able to get out of it with given those limitations.
Yeah, you're talking about, the PlayStation being the superior product. And in practicality wise, that's the truth. I mean, there's no way around that. I mean, you can just look at, I mean, Tomb Raider is a prime example of how the PlayStation can outperform the Sega Saturn whenever the Sega Saturn was the original console for the development phase. Um, and that's what really sucked about it, was that Sega just threw this extra chip in at the last minute,
Mm.
trying to be on par. And you look at it, I mean, we had to get almost to Burning Rangers before, we actually had people who were capable of programming for this thing and doing something with it. I mean, prime example,
Yeah.
back to Resident Evil. You look at the dithering effects whenever it comes to water and everything like that. I mean, it's not a clean picture. And if you really look at the hardware itself, it's capable of so much more.
Oh, yeah,
GameStack did this awesome video in regards to, the comparison before it, and they've got the
yeah.
the quintessential Sega guy, the quintessential Nintendo guy. And I
Mhm.
mean, even the Sega guy had to put it out there that yes, on paper, the Sega Saturn is the better console, but in practice, the PlayStation beat it almost every single time.
Right, yeah. That's the developer friendliness of it. Just of relatively simple hardware on the PlayStation pretty much made all the difference. And just given the fact that it was out on market for a longer period, it gave developers more time to kind of really push the system's limits over several years rather than just the couple that the Saturn had.
However, if I can chime in here, going back to the Saturn, which I have now for the third time, I'm discovering all of the 2D games that have actually stood the test of time
Oh yeah.
far better than their 3D, 3D brothers and sisters. So for me, the biggest thrill about my third stage love of the Saturn is that initially I only played a few games which you could play against a friend in your living room. So I played lots of Virtua Fighter, I played lots of Sega Rally, I played soccer games, golf games. I actually, there was a vast amount of the PAL library that I didn't ever explore. I never played things like Tomb Raider at the time. Um, you guys know that I had a love for Casper, which was a really cheesy movie tie-in puzzle game, but I sunk hours into that. I sunk hours into Clockwork Knight. I sunk hours um, into Panzer Dragoon, but they were the only games I played. So there is a vast amount of games, and particularly 2D games now, that I am exploring, and with the help of the Pseudo Saturn, which we'll come to at a later time, I'm actually getting to play some classic Japanese games. I'd never played an import game before 2017, and I'm just discovering the thousand or so games that are available to the Japanese market. So the world of the Saturn in 2017 has just opened up for me, and all of a lot of the games I ignored back in the day, I'm finding to be outstanding games, regardless of the fact that they're 20 plus years old. They are just outstanding games for anyone who appreciates a video game. Like right now, I'm playing what you've just said, Sam, was your first game on the Saturn. I'm playing Resident Evil, and it is a masterpiece. I know it's not a 2D game. I'm playing King of Fighters. I'm playing Sexy Parodius. I'm playing some of the amazing shmups that are there. I'm playing all of the Street Fighter games, which I'd never, ever, ever played. I was a Virtua Fighter man. I wasn't interested in 2D games at the time. 2D fighters to me looked retro and cheesy, but I'm now finding them to be the games that have stood the test of time on the system. They don't look so old. They don't look so the graphics still look great. The artwork that was used at the time really looks fantastic. So for me, it's just a joy to be discovering the vast amount of games that I missed out on back in the day. That's what's drawn me back in so heavily, and plus the community, which I guess we'll come to at another point as well.
Right. And, for me at least, whenever it comes to getting back to it, like I was talking about with the rebuilding of my library, and that was everything from Sega Genesis all the way up to the PS3 at that time. I mean, for me, the biggest deal that brought me back was my interest in modifying consoles. It was getting in there. It was actually learning how these things work, trying to fix them, trying to make them do crazy things. And at that point, YouTube was still pretty, I mean, it wasn't small by any means, but it wasn't the juggernaut we see today. I mean, you couldn't just type in how to do this and automatically have a video, So a lot of it came down to getting in these old retro forums and finding out that there was other people who actually enjoyed the same thing, not just the aspect of gaming, but just working on these things. And I can remember the very first mod chip I ever got that allowed me to open up that library because at that point the games were, I mean, we talk about inflated prices now. I mean, the prices were inflated back in 2010, 2011. I mean, some of the games that we talk about nowadays, like Burning Rangers and everything, that are $400 or $500 for the for the US, the NTSC version. I mean, even back then they were still 120, 130, $200. I mean, and for a game at that point, which was 14, 15 years old or however long it would have been, I mean, that was ridiculous, dude. I mean, I could have picked up 7 or 8 games up on the PS3 that were on discount at that point. So it was kind of just a priority thing for me. And once I was able to actually open these things up, work with the Saturn, work with the Dreamcast, actually get into them and open, like the article we had the other day, it was opening up that library is what it all boiled down to, and kind of like what you were talking about with the Pseudo Saturn. And we can make a whole entire episode about all these possibilities with these old consoles, especially the Saturn itself now. But if it hadn't been for that ability for me to modify these things and actually get into them and play what I wanted to play, instead of going through and picking up shovelware at pawn shops or whatever the case may be, I'd never be where I am today. That community that it got built off of the web, trying to figure out how to do things and figuring out that people love these games too. Because, I mean, we always think back, at least as the realm of social media and video, people think about the angry video game nerd and Nest the Punk and all of them guys. But really, truly, and honestly, way back when, it wasn't those guys. It was, no name, whoever up on, whatever web forum you were using, trying to talk to and trying to figure out something. And there was no schematics. There was no nothing. That's just what it boiled down to. And when I look back to the Saturn Junkyard's webpage, you see all these articles from back in 2006, 2008, 2010, all this stuff right there. I mean, y'all were doing it just like what I was doing all the way over here, thousands of miles away. So that tells you just how powerful this idea of gaming can be, this community can be, at least.
Yeah, for sure. So, I'm a little curious, Simon. Because we're now doing this podcast for the Saturn Junkyard here in 2017. You had mentioned earlier that you kind of came and went, through waves, as I think we all kind of tend to do when we go through our phases of playing a console incessantly for a period of time and then backing off and coming back to it. What kind of inspired your, uh, the I guess the resurrection of the Saturn Junkyard as it is right now?
Okay, well, I was thinking about this today, and initially, when I wrote the Saturn Junkyard, it was just a blog. Now it's a blog and a Facebook group, which I'm going to come to in a second. When I wrote the blog back in 2006, 2007, and I carried on doing it till about 2009, um, it was nice that I had an outlet for all of my Saturn thoughts, but the response that you get when you're blogging can be very sparse. You can sink hours into writing an article and researching it and grabbing the right images for it and so on, and you present that on a blog, and the feedback that you get can be very limited. We did have a few loyal readers back in the day that would comment, and commentators. Props to John Lee right now. Um, but then basically, it was quite a solitary task and a thankless task just blogging. now we have the Saturn Junkyard Facebook page as well. So the two things were launched concurrently and consecutively. The blog was resurrected first, and the Facebook page was started immediately after. And the two things together have been, I guess, what's resulted in the podcast that we've got today, because having a social media outlet as well as the blog has allowed us to get lots and lots of feedback straight away, to make connections straight away, to build a community straight away that the blog on its own just didn't have. So I think that the thing that's made it explode in the way that it has is the community, and I can only see it getting bigger and bigger and bigger, because there are lots of people now, independently of any of us here on the podcast, that there are people communicating every day, sharing information about the Saturn, sharing actual physical discs, sometimes, sending peripherals through the post and all kinds of stuff. So that's what's made it so encouraging and exciting for me, is the fact that the Facebook page and the blog can run at the same time, and we've all got an outlet to write articles and to draw people's attentions to things on the blog, but we actually have the immediate feedback and the connection that we've got from the Facebook page.
Yeah, and certainly, I mean, a lot of the posts and the threads that have come up from the community are pretty engaging. I mean, I love checking the Junkyard Facebook page every day, and just seeing what else has come up as a topic of conversation, or what somebody has posted is like their recent finds, or something they're trying to get more information on, or just even reminiscing about an old game that kind of gets people thinking about their experiences with it. Yeah, it's a pretty cool tool for that, for sure. And it kind of just helps foster itself or foster the community, and gives people opportunity to share whatever the hell's on their minds, which is awesome. I think I just checked it. It looks like we're at 243 members right now, as of this recording.
Yeah, and that's within a matter of weeks of it starting. So yeah, I think it's going to be big. It's big already, as far as I'm concerned. 200 is massive. There's more feedback in 200 people than I got in the entire time I ran the the Saturn Junkyard in its first incarnation. I'll say that again. I've actually um, enjoyed more feedback since we've been running the Facebook page than I had in the whole of the rest of the time I was blogging on the Saturn Junkyard. So it's been the Facebook page has really made things much better, and I think it's what's got us all together right now.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this all boils down to the fact, and it's kind of in a way it's sad, but at the same time it's just a reflection of reality. I mean, everything nowadays is so much geared towards immediate gratification, just immediate gratification. Back in the 90s, whenever we were doing this, I mean, you'd have to run down to the store to get a magazine, or, if you were lucky enough in the US to have satellite or cable, and I mean, a lot of us back then were still running rabbit ears. I mean,
Yeah.
you didn't have this immediate conversation about things you enjoyed. I mean, it just wasn't there. Now that fire can continue to be stoked. Before the Saturn Junkyard came around, there was a YouTuber by the name of Sega Lord X. He's had some issues go down, and currently he's not making videos anymore. He's not even on YouTube anymore, but he still has a Facebook page, and he comes on there from time to time. But I had to actually see other people still interested in this stuff, because I mean, you look on YouTube, you look on whatever it is, IGN or whatever the case may be, whenever you get your gaming fix from, and they're never talking about the old school stuff. It wasn't until just a couple of years ago that you really had this movement of retro, and people started going
Yeah.
back, and I think a lot of it, at least for me, is the simple fact that a lot of these newer games, they don't have the same story. You have to be online. You have to be
Yeah.
playing with somebody else. You know, if there is a story, it's 10, 12 hours at max. That's like maximum. After that, you might as well just give it a rest because it's never going to happen. You know, things like Horizon Zero Dawn, The Last of Us, those story-driven games, I absolutely love them because it reminds me back to the 90s in the early 2000s whenever we had those games like Shenmue, like Skies of Arcadia, you know, going back to Phantasy Star, Final Fantasy, all these games that could keep me locked in. And then we also, like you were talking about, Simon, we had little quick pleasures and stuff like that, like my little thing with SimCity and your thing with, Casper and all. We just don't get that same kind of gaming experience
Yeah.
anymore. It's just, I take it for this. You know, I'm a huge first person shooter fan, and I am almost to the point of just being burned out on first person shooters because it's just a flood of you got to buy this, you got to buy this. If you want to actually compete online, you've got to spend 30, 40, 50, $60 just to get this so you can actually, it's pay to play, man. And you know,
Yeah.
I really enjoy the fact that I can drop down however much money it is today, or even back then I could drop down that 50, $60 and I knew I had a game, I knew I had quality. And the whole community we've built up around Facebook, and hopefully, we can expand it even further. We can bring in more people. We can make this into a tight knit Saturn community, which it's already blooming into. I mean, you're talking about the numbers. When I first joined up, we had like 100 people. That was a month ago. We've doubled in size, tripled in size, and but that community is what keeps me going. It's the people in it that continue to talk about games that I never even knew about. And I mean, as far as I'm concerned, I got a complete U.S. library, but there's still count. I mean, the Japanese had over 1,000 games. I mean, there is, and most of them are, import friendly. I mean, you're playing Biohazard, you're playing the easier version of Resident Evil. I might have you, but you're still playing it, man. And that's what it all boils down to, man. So. I, I don't know. Do either one of y'all have any like final thoughts, at least in regards to this first podcast? I think we really hit some ground and made some points with some personal stories and everything, and how the system itself and how the community and what's basically been a resurrection has impacted us at this point.
Yeah, I mean, you were kind of talking a little bit earlier about other YouTube channels and other sites and Facebook pages that are kind of, have helped foster this resurgence of a retro culture. And I think in many ways, with your Game Sacks and Metal Jesus Rocks and all of those, what's really cool about those that type of content compared to ones that are trying to keep up with whatever's going on in modern times, so to speak, is that you could go back and watch some of these videos from a few years ago, and they're just as relevant now. Like you're going to get just as much out of them, uh, you know, archive wise and informational wise as you would, or a lot more so, with the Saturn and retro based content than you would with something that's trying to keep up with the the next Ubisoft controversy or whatever. So, because all that stuff is like, it gets a lot of hits, but, it's not relevant after a day or two.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true, Brian. And the other thing is as well that in watching videos about the Saturn by people like, the GameSack people, Metal Jesus, and so on, I've actually watched their programs now about the Genesis and about the Master System. So it's led me further into retro gaming and further back, and it's enabled me to discover quite a few games which were prequels to the ones I've enjoyed on the Saturn. So it's all good, all good.
Well, good times, I guess. So I guess this is kind of our contribution in many ways to trying to help build out that culture, specifically for the Sega Saturn. And I'm happy to be on board.
All right, everybody. On behalf of myself, Father K, and Virtual Schlub, I want to thank all of y'all for making it this far with us. Without y'all, this community wouldn't be anything. So if you are by some chance listening in on this podcast and you're not a member of the Facebook group, go to Facebook, You can find us by typing into the search bar, The Saturn Junkyard. You can also find us on Twitter, and you can also find us on YouTube. Now, if you want to actually see our blog, you can go to Blogspot. You can find that at thesaturnjunkyard.blogspot.co.uk. Again, from all of us here at the Junkyard, this is us, signing off.
Okay, goodbye, everyone.
See ya.